At the beginning of this century, only 8% of marriages ended in divorce. Today, it's almost 50%. This disturbing trend in the instability of marriage can also be seen in the Catholic Church, as increasing numbers of people seek annulments, or rulings by church courts that the individuals concerned had never been in a true marriage, even if they might have gone through a church ceremony and have had children. There are a few areas in the Church's life today which raise more questions. We hope to clarify some of the issues surrounding annulments in this episode of the St. Charles Forum.
The Eternal Word Television Network presents the St. Charles Forum from St. Charles Borromeo Seminary in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Welcome to the St. Charles Forum. We are quite privileged to have three very distinguished guests with us today to discuss the question of annulments. The Reverend Monsignor Cormac Burke is an Irishman who sits on the highest court of the Church, known as the Roman Rota. Monsignor has flown in from Rome just to be with us on our program today. Monsignor, welcome. Also with us is Father Vincent Rigdon, a judge from a marriage appeals court in the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C. Father, welcome. And finally, we have with us a married layman and Catholic scholar, Dr. John Crosby of the Franciscan University of Steubenville. Welcome, John. Thank you. So, gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us. Father Rigdon said to me earlier, to have the two of them on the show is like having a circuit riding judge and a Supreme Court justice on the same show. So we're very grateful for both of you being here, and especially for Monsignor coming from such great distance. We hear a lot about annulments, and usually it seems to conjure up negative connotations in our minds. We tend to associate it almost naturally with divorce, and nobody considers divorce to be a good thing. Monsignor Burke, are annulments a bad thing? Are they a kind of Catholic divorce?
Well, certainly not a Catholic divorce. I think if there's a bad thing here, it's the fact that a marriage which apparently was properly entered and lasted for a certain time is discovered after a judicial process to be null, in other words, never to have existed. And the badness would be traced back to the original defect in the consent given.
So an annulment is actually a declaration by a church court that this couple never had actually
that there never was a real marriage bond. In that sense, it's different to divorce, in that divorce, which of course the Church doesn't accept, but where it is accepted is declaring that an existing valid bond no longer stands, putting an end to a valid bond.
Okay, and we can't do that in the Catholic Church.
The Church says if the bond is valid from the start, it lasts until death.
So, Father Rigdon, there is no such thing as divorce then in the Catholic Church?
Well, certainly not for a sacramental bond, not for a ratified sacramental bond.
Mm-hmm. A regular Catholic marriage that we understand.
Regular Catholic marriage, yeah.
There's no divorce. John, what's required for people to bring about a marriage? How does a marriage come into being in the first place?
Yeah. I guess I'm the only one here who has done it, besides, of course, yourself. But it is as I understand it, this may not be canonically quite correct, a fundamental act of man and woman whereby they make themselves belong one to another. They hand themselves over to each other in such a way as to belong to each other, forming an incomparable unity between themselves, and in the order of creation, that's a unity in God, and therefore is an indissoluble bond.
So marriage is a universal, natural phenomenon. People get married all over the world, right?
Of course, and this indissolubility of it is not just a peculiarity of Catholic teaching, because after all, our Lord himself says, when he talked about the divorce that Moses had allowed to the Jews, that it wasn't supposed to be this way in the beginning, and that implies that the norm from the beginning that belongs to the creation of man and woman is a norm that requires an indissoluble union. no divorce.
Indissoluble. You can't break it. Now, when a man and a woman give themselves to one another, do they take on a shared common task?
Well, of course, they take on a common life. They take on responsibility for each other. They take on openness to possible new life and responsibility for children that may come of that. That's, of course, a collateral reason for the indissolubility of marriage, the need of the children. Perhaps the deeper reason, though, is the very nature of this self-donation. It would somehow be annulled and denied if it were thought to be temporary and revocable.
Okay, so the people that enter into this have to know what they're doing, right? They're giving themselves to one another, and they have to be free in doing it.
And if I meant, they also have to be sincere in doing it. One of the grounds of a declaration of nullity is that one, or perhaps even both of the parties, did not actually, though they uttered the words of consent, did not fully consent. They either excluded the permanence of the bond or the exclusiveness relationship of one-to-one or children. And then though they utter the words, that would be an invalid consent. That's has been one of the traditional grounds called simulation of a declaration of nullity.
Simulation, in other words, they were faking it.
Exactly.
Yes.
It's a conscious process. It could be of both, but rather of one. And obviously, if the other person were to be held bound to such a false union, let's say if they're being deprived of the right to have children, at least to the possibility of having children, it would be a grave injustice.
How do you determine if somebody was faking it?
Well, that's why you need a judicial process. They have to produce evidence, and the other side has interrogated different witnesses, and then there's a whole process at different levels and goes through different appeals, or has, at least, Father could explain more on the normal level, has to be confirmed or negatived when it would come to us.
To the Supreme Court, the High Court.
Yes, if there are two, for a nullity declaration to become final, there must be two conforming decisions. In other words, two for the bond or two against the bond. And that normally ends the matter.
I see. And
But
so
if
you have
it is conforming, then it would automatically come to the Rota.
Sort of a tiebreaker decision.
Exactly.
Now, as I understand it, the main reason for annulments today is not so much the simulation factor, but some kind of psychological incapacity on the part of one or the other or both
what
to
is
assume the
principal
obligations.
reason?
I'd be glad to hear more about that from you.
With your permission, the developments in psychology, the first code of canon law, which was the 1918 code, talked about what would happen if somebody had amencia. I mean, it was really insane, and that quite clearly, if somebody is suffering from some serious insanity, could not contract marriage, or for that matter, any other kind of contract. That's pretty clear. Then, with the developments in psychology, especially in the 40s and 50s and stuff, people began to realize that there were different levels of this. That someone, could be living an apparently normal life. It might be afflicted in some way perhaps seriously enough that they might not legitimately be able to contract. And so more and more of the so-called psychological grounds were growing up, and of course there was a lot of the Rota dealt with many of these cases. There were a lot of decisions. It's like Supreme Court, decisions and so forth. You'd base your jurisprudence on it. After the Vatican Council, and it's very interesting that when Pope John the 23rd called for the Vatican Council, at the same time he called for a revision of the Code of Canon Law. A lot of people forget that, but they're part of the same things. And of course, the Vatican Council ended in '62. The code did not come out until '83. So that's more than 20 years later. And a lot of the decisions, a lot of the jurisprudence that had been developed was quite literally canonized, in the Code of Canon Law. These particular psychological grounds, the premier canon, not the only, but the premier one about this would be Canon 1095, which has 3 sections. One dealing with, quite clearly, insanity, one dealing with lack of due discretion of judgment, and then the other one being inability to assume the obligations of marriage due to causes of a psychic nature.
Mm-hmm. And what's the lack of due discretion?
It would be that someone didn't have the knowledge, didn't have the judgmental ability because of a lack of knowledge to really commit to what was necessary for marriage.
Monsignor Burke, would this mean if someone were just immature at the time they were entering into marriage or going through the ceremony?
Well, simple immaturity wouldn't be sufficient grounds. I think most people, when they marry, are not as mature as probably they are 20 or 30 years later. like all of us in life, but if you take the case, just the fact that a person, say, was 17 or 18 years old wouldn't wouldn't be sufficient grounds. It would have to be, I would say, a sort of pathological immaturity. In other words, just broadly speaking, if you could show that the person at that age of 18 had a maturity level of a 12-year-old, then yes, the marriage could be declared null. I think it's important there to add to what Father said, that of course the psychic incapacity must be an incapacity that prevents a person from understanding or assuming the essential obligations of marriage.
And what would they be, so we can all...
Well, that is a matter that's still, to some extent, being determined by jurisprudence, but I think they center around what have always been called the three values of marriage, which go back to the time St. Augustine was the first to really coin this marvelous term of that marriage is good. He was defending marriage, it's very interesting to recall this, against a wave of pessimism about marriage itself on the part of the Manichaeans, a heretical sect. And his great defense was based on the idea that marriage naturally is good because of three values, or three goods, and those three goods are the good of fidelity, of exclusiveness, one person with one, of the permanence of the bond, and of openness to children.
Now, of course, bona comes from the Latin bonum, which means good, a good. Okay, and bona.
But if a person doesn't understand what is involved essentially in those three, well, then certainly they would lack discretion to contract marriage.
So if they went into a marriage not realizing it's for life, it had to be exclusive, and it had to be open to children, then they wouldn't really have entered into a marriage.
Exactly. Or if they were incapable of living the obligations. I mean, if a person were so absolutely, let's say, sexually promiscuous that they were incapable of living marital fidelity, well, then the marriage could certainly be declared null.
Father Rigdon, what's the process involved if somebody in a couple or a couple together believes that their marriage is null? What process do they go through to have a church court make a determination on this?
Well, I would say that, first of all, pastorally and juridically, the first place you should go is to your parish priest, because an annulment is always, it's a juridical process, and it's a last resort. You know, it's really the last resort. You're not, you know, you're supposed, the church wants to try to keep the marriage together, to help a wounded marriage, if at all possible. So for whatever reason, I would say go to your parish priest first. If ultimately, you know, there is no hope, or at least you see no hope, you might approach the tribunal, again, usually through your parish priest. He will know who to call, he will have the appropriate questions, and so on and so forth. But
then it becomes an actual juridical process.
Once it is accepted by the tribunal, then it becomes a juridical process.
Is it accepted by the local tribunal on the recommendation of the parish priest?
Not on his recommendation. I mean, see, the thing is, no one has a right to an annulment, but everybody in the church has a right to a judicial settlement of a matter at issue. I mean, it might be annulment or something else. So you have a right to a hearing, you know. And so therefore, I would say that if one of the other parties is really, there's the last resort, you know, and they finally go to their parish priest, and then, or if they could even approach the tribunal directly, but we normally like to have the parish priest.
Good. Well, we're going to have to explore these questions when we come back after this break.
St. Charles Forum will return in a moment.
Welcome back to the St. Charles Forum as we discuss the question of annulments. Father Rigdon, who is a judge on one of the marriage tribunals in this country, was explaining the procedure. And Father, you were saying that the couple usually goes first to the parish priest, and then their case is taken to the diocesan court or tribunal. Is that correct?
That's true. They could approach it directly, but usually going to the parish priest is good, because he'll know what to ask.
Now, what's a tribunal? Are there actual judges on it?
Oh, yes. Yes, there are. And the judges must have at least a licentiate in canon law or a doctorate.
Canon law is the law of the church.
Of the church, yes. It's based on Roman law. And so it's a different kind of law from what our American English jurisprudence has. It's more akin to civil canon, civil law in Europe, for example.
So the judges have to have to be degreed.
Yes.
Okay, and they sit on the court. Who appoints them?
The bishop would. The bishop would appoint, because he is the supreme judge, really, in each diocese. The bishop is, and obviously has so many things to do. He delegates this to a judicial vicar, also known as an officialis, who is in charge of the court in his diocese.
I see. So the case is brought to the court. The judges hear the case.
That is true. Yes.
And then they pass a judgment.
Basically, in a nutshell, that's basically what happens. There is, of course, a process. The person seeking an annulment, first of all, the court wants to ascertain that there is no hope of reconciliation. Typically, once they come there, as I say, it's the last resort, and typically the courts in this country, as a general practice, will not accept a case unless and until the civil divorce has been granted. Now, that's not in canon law, it's just the usual practice, because we must exhaust all possibilities. Once the civil divorce has been granted, tragically, it looks like there really isn't too much practical hope of getting the thing together again. And
Now let's say the court passes down a judgment, and let's say they find that there is no justification for a decree of nullity, that it was really a valid marriage. Can the couple appeal that?
Well, one or the other can appeal. Yes, that's true. Either party can appeal either kind of a sentence, whether it's an affirmative, i.e. the annulment is granted, or a negative, i.e. it's denied. They can appeal, and typically that appeal will go to a second instance court. And that will be in a different diocese, a different set of judges, different defender of the bond. There's someone.
Now, a second instance court is an appeals court?
That's right. It's the first instance is the one you first go to. Second instance is the appeal court.
Are there any cases automatically go to a court of second instance or a court of appeal?
All of them would. If in the case of an affirmative sentence, to use the common parlance, the annulment is granted, it is automatically, such an affirmative sentence is automatically appealed to the second instance court, but for a somewhat somewhat less intense process than a formal appeal would be. I like to think of it as kind of quality control.
Okay, it's like a review.
Yes, a judicial review.
But let's say the court of second instance comes up with a different judgment than the first one. What happens then?
Then the tie has to be broken, and Monsignor Burke and his associates come into play.
Oh, I see. So, Monsignor, how do you receive cases then in Rome?
Well, they come precisely in what would then be normally third instance, in other words, after two non-conforming decisions. And then they come from all over the world, of course. And that's why the Rota is international in its composition. And there it's always a collegiate decision, in the sense there are always three judges, which is the ideal thing at the more local level, but not always possible.
Well, how many judges serve on the Roman Rota?
At the moment, I think there are 19. There's no fixed number, about 20.
Oh, that many?
Yes.
Do they all hear the same cases?
No. Cases assigned. We work in panels of three.
I see.
And in those three, one is what is called opponens, the man in charge, the judge in charge of seeing the case through. And once it is decided by a study of the three and by a majority vote, then he writes the decision.
And then that's handed back to the lower courts or to the local jurisdiction?
Exactly, it's informed. The parties then are informed through the...
And where do the judges of the Roman Rota come from? Who appoints them?
The Pope appoints them, and at the moment I think there are about 12 nationalities. There are two from the United States, one from Ireland, one from Czechoslovakia, one from Poland, one from Germany, two from France. And
what's the common language?
Well, Italian, I guess, is the one way. Latin in a certain used to be, but now it's more Italian.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now let's say, is that the final judgment? It goes no further? I mean, the Roman Rota breaks the tie and it just goes no further?
Oh, well, it can, that's a rather complex question. It will go no further than the Rota, but it can remain within the Rota, because you can have an appeal from first instance directly to the Rota.
Oh, I see.
And then, of course, if the Rota disagrees with the first instance decision, then that tie has to be broken by another turnus, another group of Rotal judges.
Oh, another group of Rotal judges.
So you appeal it internally within the Rota?
Yes.
Uh-huh. Yes. Can the faithful ever appeal directly to the Rota?
Oh, yes.
Oh, they can. You could skip a court of second instance, for example, in the United States and have it heard directly by the Rota.
Yes.
Yeah, the parties couldn't go initially to the Rota.
No.
They would have to go to first instance. But let us say that one party or the other said, I am not satisfied with this judgment. In fact, I appeal to Rome.
You can.
I
appeal to Peter. Right?
Exactly. Well, that's
Right.
precisely it. Yeah, you can appeal to Rome, to Peter.
Well, now, Father, you had made reference to a defender of the bond. I suppose we're talking about judges and defense. What's a defender of the bond?
Well, he is the person who sort of instantiates a judicial presumption that the marriage is valid. In our American system of criminal justice, we all know that the accused is innocent until proven guilty. In a ecclesiastical marriage tribunal, the marriage is presumed to be valid until proven invalid. And part of this is this figure known as the defender of the bond, whose job it is specifically to defend the bond, to propose all arguments possible, reasonable arguments, in favor of the validity of the marriage in question.
John, could you clarify this term bond for us a little bit more that we're talking about? It almost sounds like a thing.
Yeah, well, it is, of course, a juridical thing, and it's a moral thing. It has many dimensions to it. I'm in particular interested in these psychological grounds for declaring that no bond was ever formed. And I think I'm right in saying, am I not, that the mere fact that a marriage breaks down and that the spouses become hopelessly estranged from each other is no argument by itself.
No,
that there was no marriage at the beginning.
No, by itself, that's certainly true.
Because it can be that the spouses become estranged for very, very, very different reasons.
Sure.
In fact, in the marriage ceremony at the beginning, you give yourself to one another, yourselves to one another, for better, for worse, sickness and in health. And I suppose that would even include when the old man gets a bit grumpy. The wife is going to stand by him and maybe help him through the difficult period that's making him grumpy, right?
Exactly. And also, I think it's important to bring out what you mentioned previously, that so-called incompatibility between spouses is no grounds for annulment.
We were talking about psychic incapacity as a ground.
Yeah,
Incompatibility is not a ground at all.
Exactly.
That's an unfortunate fact, but not a ground.
So this bond that unites a husband and wife to one another is a bond that simply can't be broken.
In a sacramental marriage.
In a sacramental marriage, right.
Certainly.
Now, do we receive particular help from God and from the church in living out this bond, or is the bond itself a gift of God? Monsignor, can we look on it that way?
Well, yes, I think we can and we should. In fact, I think it's in Familiaris Consortia, the Pope speaks of how Christians should proclaim to the world the good news of indissolubility. It's a very interesting expression that he says indissolubility is good news.
So the bond's not a bad thing, it's a wonderful thing.
No, that's why I think we have got our values lost here in a certain sense over the centuries. Earlier we'd spoken about St. Augustine and his values, his bona. I think it's partly our fault as canonists that we've had to deal with the juridical question of whether it's valid or not. Each of these commitments, the exclusive, the open to life, the permanence of the bond. And we've somehow we've stressed perhaps too much the obligation side and somehow lost the sense, the awareness that this is something natural to human love, to want a permanent, open to life and exclusive relationship with someone else.
In other words, when young people come together to get married, they're thinking they want to spend the rest of their life with this beautiful person that they've come to know so well.
That doesn't mean it may not go wrong, but I think it does mean that the bond itself is something they want and that normally can be gotten through with support. You'll mention if, I made a note of something here from the Catechism because I thought it might be relevant. I think it is to what you brought up now about the help from God. This is from the New Catechism. Speaking of, I quote literally, this unmistakable insistence on the unbreakable character of the marriage bond has been a source of perplexity to some, appearing as an impossible demand. Nevertheless, Jesus has not weighed down the spouses with a burden that is impossible to bear. He himself gives the strength and grace to live marriage in the new dimension of the kingdom of God. following Christ, denying themselves, taking on themselves their own cross, the spouses can understand the original sense of matrimony and live it with the help of Christ.
So the bond provides an avenue, a channel for God's grace to come and actually help the couple live out their lives together.
Yes,
faithfulness and openness to life.
Now, I think that we need pastorally, now speaking not so much as a judge, but a bit from my experience as a judge. I've seen cases of marriages that seem to us, certainly at the Rota, valid, but which were immediately broken, certainly at that stage when it comes to us. There's no hope of putting them together. But I think with a bit of better support from sometimes in-laws or friends or neighbors or counselors, marriage counselors or so on, pastors perhaps, they could have maintained what really they wanted in their heart, which was to stick together, because, I mean, who marries wanting it to break up? Who marries wanting it to fail?
Mm-hmm. So you're saying there's just not enough support to help these people?
I think that's one of the major problems here, that we've somehow lost this idea the Pope put forward, that indissolubility is a good thing. I also had another little thing which came to me by accident just before I left Rome from my sister in Ireland, which a poll which came out just last month in February, and it says, it's very brief, a majority of people polled in a new survey think it is realistic in Ireland today for people to expect a marriage to last forever. According to the Sunday Independent IMS poll last weekend, 54% of people believed in lifelong marriage. 42% thought it was unrealistic, and 4% said they didn't know. Unrealistic. But my reaction to that was, if in fact you were to poll all of those people again and ask them, when you married, or if you do marry, would you wish, or would you expect, would you long for the fact that your marriage would last forever? I'm sure 90%, 99% would say yes, because that's what people want. Now, the Catechism stresses that we need God's help, we need God's grace. And certainly the Church says, if it can be shown judicially, there has to be a process that the marriage was not there from the start, there was no bond, that should be declared. In that sense, there is a right to nullity if the marriage is null. And the Church has an interest that there should be no false marriage maintained.
So
I think the deeper problem is, to my mind, is not juridical or judicial. We have to deal with the cases as they come to us. But the real problem is a mentality of not understanding the gifts of God and of not relying sufficiently on the grace of God, prayer, the sacraments, and certainly of friends, relatives, not at times taking sides and being too negative.
Well, when we come back after this break, we'll explore these questions further.
The St. Charles Forum will continue in a moment.
Welcome back to St. Charles Forum as we discuss the question of annulments. At the end of our last segment, Monsignor Burke was talking about the importance of having support from friends and family for a couple to stay together. John, do you find as a married man that you've got need for this kind of social support?
Well, of course. We are responsible for each other, and that witness, of marriages that persevere in hard times is all important. And I must say, I find in this regard very helpful myself the beautiful thought of John Paul, which goes back to St. Paul, that the faithfulness of spouses participates in and reflects God's faithfulness to his people. I mean, we might think of how God calls Abraham, makes promises to them. Then the children and grandchildren are there in Egypt as slaves. They've forgotten God, but he doesn't forget them. He raises up Moses and delivers them. And they're again and again unfaithful. And again, there's a divine love that won't be extinguished by their infidelity. And I think it's a very profound thought that every Catholic couple ought to always be dwelling on, that their marital faithfulness is supposed to make present in the world of men this faithfulness of God to his people. It's supposed to be
and his people weren't always all that pleasant to be with, were they? I mean, when God's people were unfaithful, God still put up with them.
Right, the fidelity somehow really proved itself.
Yeah.
When, despite the infidelity of the Jews, ever and again a covenant was offered to them. And But I think that there's a witness to this faithfulness of God that comes through a marriage which is faithful.
But a
in
faithfulness
good times and in bad times.
In good times and in bad times. Because is there ever a trouble-free marriage?
Could I? You made me think of something there which is interestingly in the new code and is one of the very innovative, very new elements, which is a new expression of what the spouses actually consent to, the consent to marry, but how to do it. Before it had a more technical term, the jus in corpus, but now it's said, it's taken up an expression of the Vatican Council, Gaudium et Spes, that the spouses mutually give and accept each other to constitute marriage. And I think from what you're saying, a lot of stress is put on the idea of self-gift, but perhaps not enough is put on the idea of acceptance of the other. And obviously in marriage, as in any human situation, we're all defective people. And two people who marry, it's obviously the union of two people with defects.
That's right.
It's natural. But then part of the marital commitment, which I think people understand, but perhaps has to be put to them more, is that I'm marrying someone who has defects, and I hope that he or she will accept me with my defects, as I am disposed to accept him or her with their defects.
So we have to go into marriage with our eyes open.
With our eyes open, yes. But I think when the moment comes of difficulty, then, as you say, God's fidelity is there as an example, but also communicating grace to married people to be faithful. Right. And that's a great example to the world. And my own pastoral experience before I was a judge at the Rota, which goes through quite a number of years, was that so many married couples do get through difficulties and want to, but if they're given support and if they themselves pray and go to the sacraments and so on.
In fact, that unconditional love of the spouse that perseveres in hard times has a great creative power. I mean, it can breathe like new life into a needy spouse.
And help a couple overcome problems that they might not overcome because they would give up too easily.
Well, I think that's why the Pope says it's good news, and perhaps married people need to be helped to realize that in being faithful in difficult times, they're really evangelizing the world. They're giving a colossal example to their neighbors and to many, many, many people.
Well, Father, it's never been easily understood, has it? I mean, even our Lord's time.
Yeah, that's what people don't remember, is that when our Lord spoke about indissolubility of marriage, he said, originally it was not so, and people said, this is hard saying. Who can stand it?
Said this to our Lord himself.
Yes, the apostles, said this to him. I mean, because it's not like people say, well, now in our days things are so difficult. It was a lot easier back then, 2,000 years ago. It wasn't. Divorce was part of the phenomena, part of the situation then. And our Lord said that that with God all things are possible. He didn't say it was going to be easy.
The apostle said, well, then it's better not to marry.
Better not to marry. Yes.
No, with God. Without God, it won't work, but with God, it can.
Sure, all things are possible there, but he never said it was going to be easy. So it's.
I think that's the point of incompatibility comes up, because incompatibility, as you said, is not an acceptable term in canonical jurisprudence. But two people are never incompatible when they marry, I think. Psychologists might say so, but they can become intolerable to each other if they don't learn to accept each other's defects and are not helped to do so.
Well, we have this wonderful opportunity to have two legal experts with us, and while you're here, I want to take advantage of your expertise just to have some other questions answered. Some of our viewers may have heard terms such as external forum and internal forum. Father, can you tell us what they refer to?
Well, the external forum would refer to that which is publicly knowable. The judicial sentence, something that happens in that is known, and that is, that what the tribunal does is all external forum. The internal forum is.
Pardon me. So when the tribunal makes a decision, that's in the external forum.
Precisely, yes.
And it's published.
It is the acts, as they are called, rather the sentence is published. Now that doesn't mean it's put in the diocesan newspaper, but it means that the parties and their advocates, have available to them a copy of that sentence, and that in fact, if, let us say, the finding is for nullity of the marriage, then a notification is sent to the church of baptism of the parties, saying that this person is free to marry.
That's entered on their baptismal record.
Precisely, it is. Just as the marriage is entered on the baptismal record, should the marriage be annulled, that fact is also entered on the baptismal record. So it's published in that sense, but I mean, you don't expect to see it in the diocesan newspaper.
Yeah, of course not, right. Now, what does internal forum refer to? Because I've heard people say, well, I got an annulment in the internal forum and it's not published, nobody knows about it. Is that true or not?
Well, the internal forum is, we all go to it when we go to confession. You know, we're in the internal forum then. And the thing about the internal forum is that it is internal. And it'd be very hard to get all the tribunal personnel into a confessional, you know, no, that's it. But, you know, the thing is, basically sometimes you might have a case where something, well, for example, you have the brother-sister situation. That is to say, a couple, they are in an invalid marriage, they know it, they have children. They don't want to separate for the sake of the children, but they cannot have sexual union. And so privately, you know, not necessarily in the confessional, but in a non-public situation, they agree that they will live as brother and sister so that they can bring up their children and so forth.
No, they have to do that before a representative of the church, before a pastor or
This would be maybe through in spiritual direction or something like that, and they then would be able, since they are not having sexual activity outside of marriage, they'd be able to approach the sacraments, but they would have to do it in a place where they were not known. Where it's not known that they were supposedly married outside the church.
To avoid scandal.
To avoid scandal, yes, exactly. Mm-hmm. That would be, I think, the classic example of an internal forum. There are other things that sometimes can be abused if...
So it's not simply a matter of a couple deciding themselves that, well, the church tribunal said this is really a valid marriage, but the one we were in before, but we don't really think it was. So the internal forum doesn't refer to their just making a subjective decision on their own.
No. There is a forum. In fact, there's a whole thing in the Vatican, the Sacred Penitentiary, but we can't go into that. But that has all to do with internal forum.
Oh, I see. Well, the question of conscience comes up here, though, right at this point. I mean, if a couple in conscience thinks that their first marriage was invalid, even though the church has declared it to be valid, and therefore they can't remarry. The couple can't follow their conscience, Monsignor, in a case like that?
Well, I think they'd have to rethink the question of conscience here, because if it's not possible or it hasn't been proved before a tribunal, going through all of the procedure that's been established to study things thoroughly in depth and in fairness, if it's not established that the marriage was null, I think it's very, very hard to imagine that a couple could have any real certainty with basis to justify a conclusion on their own. Really, in the end, they would be setting themselves up as the law, taking the law into their own hands.
Didn't the Pope even say that we can't put conscience above the
this is part of his address to the Rota. Each year he gives an address to the judges and the personnel of the Rota. Just a month ago, and he dealt with that precise point as part of his address, that he's aware that there is something going on in different parts in that line of people saying, well, in conscience I feel that my marriage is valid, even though I can't get a declaration, therefore I will go to the sacraments, and he was saying this cannot be done. To my mind, the really deeper thing, the point that Bob was getting at, is that conscience is probably used there inaccurately. It's not their conscience, it's their feelings. Mm-hmm. He was saying, my heart, I believe that my marriage was invalid. But, it's not a question of heart, it's a question of having certainty, and that certainty has to be based on objective things, and if a tribunal cannot come to a judgment there, I don't see how a person could possibly.
Mm-hmm. Could it though be that you would have a case where crucial witnesses refuse to cooperate, so that a person would have a very well-founded judgment in his conscience that there was no valid marriage, and yet it can't be proved before the court?
Yes, but I mean, in a certain sense, John, the Church allows, especially on these questions of what is called the states of persons, and particularly marriage, that the issue is never, in a certain sense, finally closed. And if a person, let's suppose that a declaration of annulment has been twice denied on the first and second instance, therefore the matter in theory, in principle, is closed, that person can still appeal directly to the Rota to have the case reopened. Yeah. But that is only done, it is done at the Rota, if there are new arguments, serious arguments, or if one can show there has been a miscarriage of justice, you know. So the matter can always be reopened at any judicial level, but not simply because the person doesn't agree with the decision. I mean, that's.
I would think it important to stress that marriage is not only a purely interior thing. It's not just this subjective love of the spouses, central as that is, but it's a public thing. It's a formal act. And it has, by its very nature, a public-sided juridical dimension, and therefore it falls within this external forum, and the spouses have to have this permission of
John,
the
could you as a philosopher bring some clarity to this distinction between, let's say, feelings and conscience? I mean, a conscience. What is a conscience actually?
Well, conscience is basically that power of the person whereby he brings the moral law, which we all understand in general, and he brings it to bear on his own concrete circumstances, and he tries to determine what the laws of God mean for him in his particular set of circumstances. And it can be very demanding and require a good deal of moral imagination. If it's not just a question of violating some moral prohibition.
Because the Holy Father in this encyclical on moral theology, Veritatis Splendor, talks about the dignity of conscience, and the Catechism does as well, is derived from its conformity to truth.
Exactly.
The truth.
It doesn't create its norm, or it's not, like the creation of an artist, but the idea is to assess my behavior in light of the moral law, and get as faithful a reading as I can on what it requires of me.
I think to say conscience is a law perceiver, it is not a law giver.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Just what
on
the Pope
which
wanted to say.
to conclude this segment before we come back to discuss this in our final segment. We'll see you shortly.
We'll return in just a moment.
Welcome back to our discussion of annulments. Monsignor Burke, I have to ask a troubling question, and it confuses a lot of people. If the Church grants a decree of nullity, let's say after a couple has been together for 25 years, has had 5 children, does this decree of nullity imply that the children are therefore illegitimate?
Oh, no way. No, that's clearly established. I mean, in canon law, they're being born of what was recognized as a marriage then, and they're not. There's no stance of illegitimacy. The only thing perhaps I would add, because I've seen this at the Rota, you see at times, especially in a marriage of long standing where the children are more grown up, I've seen questions put to tribunals, lower tribunals at that level, and answered correctly. No. In other words, the question was, you say the result is that we are illegitimate, and they answer properly, no. That's not so. But then a person comes back and says, but you are saying that my parents or our parents were never husband and wife. And of course, that is true. And that's why it's such a hurtful thing for the children, for everyone involved.
Can we make a distinction between, let's say, the civil effects and the ecclesiastical effects? Because would illegitimacy be more a civil term than an ecclesiastical one?
It lies in civil law here, the question of illegitimacy.
So, certainly not because of an annulment.
Not because of an annulment,
no.
No.
And in canon law, and let's see, canon 1137, it just says children conceived or born of a valid or putative marriage. That is one where somebody sincerely believes it, one of the parties believes its marriage are legitimate. But then again, in canon law, illegitimacy doesn't really cause as many troubles as it used to.
Okay, well that's I'm sure comforting to a lot of people to know that kind of judgment is not being passed with regard to the children. Well, the Catechism talks about holy orders and matrimony as being sacraments in the service of communion, and sacraments which are really instituted more for the salvation of others than of the individual himself or herself. Does this give us some insight, John, into the nature of marriage and a marital relationship?
Yeah. Well, I think the fact that we are not just made for ourselves, but made, as the Council teaches, for making a gift of ourselves to another, that's the beginning of wisdom with regard to marriage.
But it's
And
hard, it's hard for us to accept that, though, isn't it? I mean, the idea of giving away oneself
there's
to
a
someone else.
natural fortification in oneself and an assertion of one's rights that is a tremendous obstacle to living this self-donation, not just in marriage, but even in faithful friendship.
I have a good Dominican friend who refers to our Lord saying that we must die to self, and this Dominican says he has a very hard time convincing people that dying to self is not fatal. You know, they're afraid to really give of themselves. Well, Monsignor Burke has a wonderful line in his book, which I'd be happy to draw your attention to, called Covenanted Happiness, which is published by Ignatius Press. But Monsignor Burke talks about some of the problems that arise when a married couple simply stare into one another's eyes. Can you embellish that for us a little bit?
Yes, well, I think I remember I don't read my own books too much. I can tell you enough to write them. But I think the point there is simply that, to my mind, the design of nature of God is that people do marry normally because they're in love, and love to a certain extent is blind, and blind to the defects of the other. I mean, this all seems to be a natural thing, and that doesn't show a lack of discretion in the canonical sense. But after a number of years, they discover each other's defects as soon as romance begins to wane. And here I think a great mistake, this is perhaps a little bit off our topic, but you've brought it up. It seems to me the great mistake today for many couples is to postpone having children for quite a period, when the plan of nature is that precisely when romance begins to wane and they can no longer just satisfy each other by looking at each other, they should be gradually looking together at their children, at the fruit of their love. And then their concerns and their hopes and their responsibilities are directed to the children. And that, I think, keeps a marriage going.
That helps bond, or strengthen the bond that they have between them. If I could,
coming back to John's point about the self-giving, I think one of our big problem, of course we all are aware of this today, is that the church and the council and married personalism, of which you know so much, and Christian personalism, says we can only realize ourselves by the gift, by giving ourselves. Well, we happen to live in a generation which is dominated by secular psychology that builds on the idea of self-realization, of self-fulfillment, of self-identification, and therefore suspicious of any commitment.
I'm marrying because I want to be happy.
I want to be happy, and she or he should make me happy. Now, I think that's the background to all of our divorce problems, our annulment problems. I say if an annulment of a marriage is null, it should be declared null. But unfortunately, many come to court, and coming to the Rota too, I mean, are not all declared null. There are sometimes it's valid, but it's broken. Because I think there was simply a lack of support in the process of giving and of accepting the other with his or her defects. And I think this is the real problem underlying the whole thing.
In our modern society, some people may actually not have that commitment to the three goods of marriage.
Oh, then we're back to simulation. If you deliberately exclude one of those, I mean, as we said, either the exclusive one-to-one relationship, the permanence of the bond, or the openness to children, then the consent is invalid.
But if at the heart of marriage is this giving of self to the other and the receiving of the other with his or her defects, we see right there naturally arising the three goods again, because the good of exclusivity, only you, sweetheart, you're the only one now in my life, forever, so the permanence is the second good. And then that giving of self to one another and receiving of the other, even with defects, blossoms forth a new life. So you have all the three goods there, which are the most natural thing on earth.
They're fundamentally natural.
Well, marriages do break down, however, and there's great pain, and it can become very difficult, and yet to live together, and yet you can have a court saying, no, this is a valid marriage. What's the way out for people who find themselves in a situation like this? Monsignor? Where do they look for help once the court has said, no, this is a valid marriage, and they're suffering in this relationship?
Well, I think they really have to look to our Lord. I mean, here, in a certain sense, there is no way out of that situation of a marriage declared valid, or the nullity of which has not been proved. Therefore, they should accept that, also in conscience. But I think that's not condemning them to a meaningless existence, and it's not the church being harsh. I think it's God's law. It's certainly tough. Our Lord made no bones about that. And but we go back to our Lord's statement, when the apostles reacted, then it's better not to marry, and his idea that with men it may be so, but with God it's possible. And I think there you have to bring people back not only to the need to pray more, but let's take perhaps the more extreme case that may be in your mind, I mean, where they have actually broken up completely and maybe one has gone off.
Yeah, let's say one's left his spouse. Let's say the man's gone off and left his poor wife behind with the children.
Yeah.
Well, I think there you have not only an aspect of the cross, but you have a specific Christian vocation that is really mentioned in your idea now that you brought out from the Catechism, that the mission of service towards the community, that that person left on his or her own, the example of a person like that in living fidelity to the bond, to the commitment, even though their partner has been unfaithful, has a colossal impact. I mean, not only a colossal merit before God, in a way, it's a way of sanctity. The Pope at the end of Veritatis Splendid, you could perhaps speak more about that. It speaks about the martyrdom of those who really are faithful to the truth. But that has a tremendous impact on people around them. I think the world today needs that impact. If people are faithful to a commitment, freely accepted, even though that commitment now involves them in extreme hardship. That's an heroic vocation and a heroic call to sanctity. The grace is there to live that.
So, John, how do you feel comfortable with taking the concept of martyrdom into the very heart of marriage?
Well, I think that if you're uncomfortable with the concept of martyrdom, you should just stop calling yourself a Christian, because we have a Redeemer who attains to the resurrection through the cross, and we can hope to share in his resurrection by being conformed to him in his passion and suffering. And so we have to somehow deal with this natural human response to pain and suffering that shouldn't be there. I didn't ask for it, violates my rights, and think more in a more Christian way about that as in the providence of God, the instrument for my sanctification.
So, I mean, being very blunt about it, we're saying an innocent party has been left by one spouse who has gone off and married another, and yet that person should give witness to God's fidelity, as you were saying earlier, John, by not remarrying themselves and by doing their utmost to raise the children, perhaps without the help of the spouse.
It's an heroic vocation, and one has an extraordinary reward in heaven. I think there's no doubt about that.
Yeah. Well, we lose perspective of heaven, don't we? I mean, so often we look at all these questions simply on the temporal realm and lose sight of our ultimate vocation. In fact, I mean, the Code of Canon Law, right at the end, says,
my favorite canon,
says something about the purpose of the whole code.
The whole point of the code, and I really love it. I try to quote it in whatever decisions I can quote it in, and it basically says, with regard to the matter in question, it says all of these things with due regard for canonical equity and having before one's eyes the salvation of souls, which is always the supreme law of the Church. It's the last code.
So we're talking about our ultimate salvation, our happiness with God is what leads us to this life of fidelity to the spouse, and when we've been deserted, remaining still loyal to that spouse out of love for God and love for the spouse. Well, are there things that can be done, let's say, to strengthen marriage more? Say, I'll ask within the life of the Church itself, within society, and in individual marriages. Father Rigdon, is something the Church can be doing these days?
Helping with the preparation process. I mean, as I say, once it's hit the tribunal, it usually, I mean, for all practical purposes, there's no, humanly speaking, there's no hope. I mean, and so the time to really work on it, it's not just in the marriage preparation process, it's in raising your children. Before, it's in them being raised in their family. It's also, of course, in their religious instruction. It's also in the whole, and of course, the sad thing is our society is so suffused with this whole lack of commitment idea. That's a thing.
Yeah, that's
so to begin turning things around, we start actually with the education of our children.
Sure.
So that we hope in the next generation we might see the divorce rate dropping again.
That's the start. I mean, it's a big job. Being a Christian's a big job,
But I'd like to ask Monsignor here. We have about 2 minutes left. But
could I just put in there? I think one point I've seen from the cases that come to us at the Rota, I think that marriage counselors have to be very sure of their own Christian psychology, put it that way, in giving advice, and to be very careful when they use terms like self-assertion. I've seen that advice given in a particular case I'm thinking of now, I won't say from where, but given to a person. You have to assert yourself more in your marital relationship, and that blew the marriage apart. Whereas she was happy with the situation. But she ended up.
So you're saying you can get bad advice from marriage counselors,
Oh,
and
you
you
can,
have
but I
to,
think
you
that-
have to
that
be
the-
discreet about the kind of advice
Well, I mean, the
you're
idea
receiving.
of giving, of self-giving, and on both sides, not just what unilateral.
And also, I think the capacity of the human person to make a commitment, to take on a responsibility. There's so many trends that want to take our freedom away from us and to treat us just as the plaything of foreign influences.
The best exercise of our freedom is to give ourselves and to be faithful to that commitment.
So you're saying then, Monsignor, that Catholics aren't less free because of the Church's discipline on marriage?
No. Well, it's up to them how they feel about it. But here I think that if one thinks about, I freely made a commitment 5, 10, 25 years ago to give myself to this person, and I freely choose now, in all the difficulties, to remain faithful to that. That's the best
That's
exercise.
true freedom.
That's true freedom.
Yeah.
It's a sign a person is really master or mistress of himself, herself.
And this is what the Church is calling us to, and what God offers His grace
That's the freedom
to
of
enable
Christ.
us to
Yes,
do as
with
well.
grace.
Right. Well, thank you, gentlemen, very much for being with us, and we ask all of our viewers to struggle to bring God's grace into their own marriages and to pray for the growth of sanctity in marriage throughout our nation. Thank you so much for being with us.